This is a rotary Wankel engine. It features a triangular rotor spinning inside an epitrochoidal housing. This is a liquid piston engine, and it features an epitrochoidal rotor spinning inside a triangular housing. And apparently that makes it better in every way and gives it the power to change everything. So today we're going to take an in-depth look at this engine. We'll analyze it, we'll see its benefits, its drawbacks, and we'll compare it with traditional piston and traditional Wankel engines to see its potential to change everything. Obviously, to analyze the engine, we must first understand it. And the best way to understand it is to compare it with a conventional Wankel engine. So the rotor rotates, and as it does that, it creates an empty space, aka vacuum. The vacuum pulls in air and fuel through the intake ports on the engine covers. The rotor rotates some more, and it compresses the air and fuel mixture into the two tiny spaces on the side. The spark plug ignites the mixture, combustion pressure builds, pushes the rotor, and torque is generated. As the rotor continues spinning, it pushes the exhaust gases out through the side of the housing. Each rotation of the rotor yields 3 combustion events. And now the liquid piston engine, which doesn't feature any pistons, nor are they liquid. It's called a liquid piston because the original idea of the inventors of this engine was to use an actual liquid as a piston. Now that didn't work out, but the name liquid piston stayed. So now we have a pistonless engine with metal rotors from a company called Liquid Piston. Now the engine itself is not called a liquid piston. The engine is called the X engine. X engine. And according to Liquid Piston, the X engine is not, that's a capital not, a Wankel engine. It has a fundamentally different thermodynamic cycle architecture and operation. Let's observe. So the air comes into the engine through the crankshaft. The crankshaft has air holes in it. The air goes through the rotor and then fills a volume inside the housing. As the rotor continues rotating, the intake port on the rotor ends up being past this seal here, so the air and fuel end up being trapped right here. Now the rotor compresses the air-fuel mixture, which eventually ends up all squeezed into this tiny space, where it gets ignited by a spark plug. Combustion occurs, pressure builds, it acts on the rotor, and torque is generated. As the rotor continues to rotate, it exposes the combusted mixture to the exhaust cavity of the rotor. The pressurized mixture rushes into this cavity, which overlaps with an exhaust port in the cover, and so exhaust gases escape from the engine. Now, if we observe both engines in operation, we can conclude that the Non-Wankel X engine, which has a fundamentally different thermodynamic cycle architecture and operation, does 3 combustion events per single rotation of the rotor, just like a Wankel. Also, just like a Wankel, it does intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust. So how is it then fundamentally different? Is this statement nonsense? It's actually not. It is an exaggeration, but it's not complete nonsense. And that's because the inverted geometry of the liquid piston X engine enables it to overcome an inherent limitation of the traditional Wankel. Now, Mr. Kenichi Yamamoto, who is the father of Mazda's Wankel engine, and he was at the forefront of Mazda's development and inspirational efforts to make the Wankel engine viable for mass production, he wrote a book in 1981, which is surprisingly called The Rotary Engine. In that book, he discusses at length the benefits, the drawbacks of the rotary engine. He does many calculations, and he also talks about the compression ratio. And it turns out that the Wankel engine has a compression ratio, a practical, sensible compression ratio limit, which is around 12:1. Due to its geometry, the Wankel engine cannot go higher than a compression ratio of 12:1. And this means 2 things. Number 1, it limits the efficiency of the Wankel engine because usually the higher the compression ratio, the greater the engine's efficiency. Number 2, it makes a diesel or a compression ignition version of a traditional Wankel engine impossible, unfeasible. Many big names have tried, nobody has succeeded. Also, it turns out that Mr. Yamamoto's conclusions stand correct more than 40 years later, because Mazda's newest and only currently mass-produced Wankel engine, which is used as a range extender in the Mazda MX-30 REV, has a compression ratio of 11.9 to 1. But the different geometry of the liquid piston engine means that it does not have a compression ratio limit, which means that a compression ignition engine, like a diesel engine, is definitely possible. And that is exactly what liquid piston has done with their compression ignition version of their design, which can run on diesel or any other heavy fuel. But the different geometry of the X engine enables another very important benefit, and that is the pistonless implementation of the Atkinson cycle. Liquid piston calls this the high efficiency hybrid cycle, but in reality it is a pistonless Atkinson cycle. Now, the whole premise of the Atkinson cycle is to have a combustion or expansion stroke that is longer than the compression stroke. Now, the compression stroke wastes, it consumes, it saps energy, whereas the combustion stroke generates energy. So if we make the combustion stroke larger than the compression stroke, then we give the energy the opportunity to extract as much energy from the combustion stroke as possible, which means reduced energy losses and improved efficiency. Now, traditional piston engines, they can also run the Atkinson cycle by manipulating intake valve timing. However, when they achieve Atkinson, they do so by reducing the compression stroke, so the expansion stroke ends up being greater than the compression stroke. But this is not ideal, because reducing the compression stroke also reduces performance. What we want to do is increase the expansion or the combustion stroke without reducing the compression stroke. Traditional piston engines cannot do this without a system of complex intermediary rods, and this was James Atkinson's original idea. However, this greatly increases friction, size, weight, cost, complexity, and it also greatly reduces the RPM limit of the engine, which is why this design never saw widespread use. Now, if we observe the unique geometry of the X engine operation and we overlay its there's no stroke expansion volume over its compression volume, we will see that the shape of the rotor, as well as the size and the positioning of the intake and exhaust ports and cavities, results in the combustion volume being noticeably larger than the compression volume. The traditional piston engine and the traditional Wankel engine, they cannot achieve this because the static sizes of their compression and combustion volumes are always the same. The fact that the X engine achieves this without any auxiliary systems or a great number of additional parts is most certainly noteworthy and impressive. And because we have a greater expansion volume, it also means that we have less wasted energy and therefore less energy, in other words, less pressure and less heat in the exhaust gas coming out of the engine. This helps the engine have reduced noise, and it also helps it run cooler. The fact that the engine also doesn't have cams or valves further reduces noise, and the fact that we don't have a reciprocating piston reduces vibration. Another benefit of the relatively simple design, the relatively low number of moving parts, together with the 3 combustion events per rotor revolution creates is high power density. The current spark ignition version prototype of the X engine, it's called X Mini. It's 70 cc, 3.6 horsepower, 4.5 pounds. But according to Liquid Piston, the mature design will be 5 horsepower, and only 4 pounds. This gives us a power density of 1.2 horsepower per pound, which is very impressive, and we can see just how impressive it is if we compare it to a conventional piston-based scooter engine, which is also 70 cc, 6 horsepower, but it's 8.8 pounds and it's much bigger, and it has a power density of 0.68 horsepower per pound, so it manages only a bit over half of what the X Mini can do. So we can conclude that this is a very lightweight, extremely compact, high power density engine which offers reduced noise and vibrations compared to most conventional piston-based engines. These are the key benefits the engine brings to the table, and based on this, Liquid Piston believes that the engine can be potentially very attractive for things like generators and auxiliary power units, UAVs, range extenders, handheld power equipment, mopeds and other small vehicles, lawn and garden equipment, robotics, and the company also plans to enter the urban mobility and automotive markets. Now, this is without a doubt a very interesting design, and I believe it deserves the attention that it's getting due to its innovative and creative nature. However, I also personally believe that outside of niche-specific UAV and generator applications, this engine has a very low chance of market entry and mass production and application. Liquid piston engines have resolved the compression ratio limitation of the Wankel, but they have not resolved the apex seals. This engine still has apex seals, they have simply changed location. Instead of being in the rotor, they are now in the housing. According to liquid piston, this is a significant benefit because the seals no longer have to withstand centrifugal forces. According to a technical paper they wrote, their current models exhibit a 35% reduction in blow by compared to a conventional Wankel, and they believe that ultimately 65% reduction may be possible. This is simply not enough for a mass application in many different markets because decent piston engines, they have a quarter or a fifth of the blow by of a Wankel. Just like the Wankel, the X engine has a complex multi-seal arrangement which does not lend itself well to mass production or longevity. If you observe Mazda's video on their assembly of their latest range extender Wankel, you will see that the engine is mostly assembled by hand in a process that requires skill and finesse. So even a company that has been working with rotary engines for decades did not manage to simplify and automate the process. And if you observe the assembly process of a modern piston engine, you will see that it's very different to the rotary. But one of the greatest issues that the liquid piston design has is lubrication. Now, any engine with apex seals struggles to lubricate the apex seals because the apex seals cannot benefit from a constantly reapplied oil film on the cylinder like piston rings can do. So what conventional rotary engines did to lubricate the apex seals is to inject small quantities of oil into the intake, into the air-fuel mixture, and this would then lubricate the apex seals, which are in the combustion space of the engine. This meant that the engine burns oil by design. And this is one of the main reasons why rotary engines have poor emissions and why they're not on the market anymore, and why they don't last as much and why they last a lot more if you mix two-stroke oil into the fuel for rotary engines. Now, liquid piston has the benefit of stationary apex seals, so they can lubricate them directly through access points in the housing of the engine. And liquid piston claims this would allow them to lubricate the apex seals much better and have oil consumption of the engine comparable to a four-stroke piston engine. I personally believe this is a bit overly optimistic, and in any case, having to burn oil to lubricate an integral part of the engine negatively impacts either engine longevity or emissions, or possibly both. But that's the minor issue in terms of lubrication of the liquid piston engine. The major issue is the crankshaft. Remember, the crankshaft has air holes in it to get air into the engine. And because air comes through the crankshaft, it means that we cannot subject the crankshaft to an oil bath or even pressurized oil. And so the liquid piston engine, as we can see from their How It's Made video, uses sealed bearings instead of journal bearings or ball bearings, which are submerged in oil, which are constantly exposed to oil. Sealed bearings are simply an inferior solution in terms of longevity compared to what conventional piston and rotary engines use, and this, together with the apex seals, is likely the reason why both the spark ignition and the compression ignition version of the X engine are expected to last only 1,000 hours between rebuilds. Modern gasoline engines in cars and bikes, good bikes, they usually manage 3,500 to 4,000 hours. Small frame diesel generators also 4,000 or 5,000 hours. Large diesels, industrial diesels, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 hours. And many users push many of these engines well beyond that in certain applications, and the engines can last a lot longer. And we can see that the X engine simply is inferior in this regard. And even the conventional rotary engine benefits from an oil sump and proper lubrication of its internals, because everything before the face seals of the rotary is lubricated by pressurized oil, and this includes the gears of the rotor as well as the eccentric shaft. The final problem that the X engine shares with the Wankel is large spaces in the combustion area. These negatively impact efficiency because the larger the space in the combustion area, the more effective it is at absorbing energy from the combustion in the form of heat. In other words, these large spaces, they rob the rotor of the energy of the combustion. The other thing that's bad for efficiency is that just like the Wankel, the X engine has large face seals on both sides of the rotor. These two things then ultimately lead to relatively unimpressive thermal efficiency figures for the X engines. We have 25% for the spark ignition version and 45% for the compression ignition version. Now, 25% for a small 70cc engine is not that bad, but this is also what very inexpensive mass production ready piston engines achieve easily. To replace them, the X Mini needs to do better. Now, 45% for a diesel is pretty decent, and although we do have diesels that can do 50% and above, small frame generators, they're usually somewhere between 35 to 40%, so this engine definitely offers, the diesel version of the X engine definitely offers an improvement here. Unfortunately, the X engine achieves its peak output of 36 kilowatts at 7,000 RPM, whereas conventional diesel generators do the same at around 2,500 RPM, which means that the X engine has no hope of lasting nearly as long as a conventional diesel generator, and this is of course further augmented by the apex seals as well as the poor lubrication we discussed earlier. The other issue which may prevent a vehicle-based diesel application is lack of torque, which is yet another feature that the X engine shares with a conventional Wankel, because both designs are devoid of the conventional crank and rod leverage. They have inherently pretty low torque. If we use the horsepower and RPM figures to calculate torque for both of the X engines, we get 2.5 Newton meters of torque for the X Mini, and we get 50 Newton meters of torque for the compression ignition. If we compare this with equivalent piston-based engines, we get that even the absolutely archaic Honda Super Cub 70cc from the late 60s does noticeably better in terms of torque, whereas a conventional diesel generator can do more than 3 times as much torque. However, it must be noted that the conventional diesel engine also weighs more than 10 times as much and is 2.5 times larger. Another potential problem that the X engine shares with the Wankel is that this engine is pretty much unsuitable for variable valve timing. Because we do not have a cam and valves, the only variable valve arrangement that can be used is one similar to the power valve that we can see on two-stroke engines. And although some rotary Mazda engines in the past, they had something like this and it does help, it's simply not as effective and not as flexible as a modern variable valve lift and timing system that can be seen on most modern piston-based engines. So let's try to sum things up. We have a very lightweight, very compact, very power-dense engine, which is also potentially very quiet and doesn't vibrate too much. But we also have poor emissions, poor torque, poor longevity, and potentially a difficulty to be adapted for inexpensive, rapid mass production. So the poor torque, poor emissions, and poor longevity make it unsuitable for road-legal vehicular applications. The same reasons also make it problematic for a range extender. The difficulty for rapid, inexpensive mass production is likely going to be a barrier for handheld power, lawn, garden applications. So what is this engine good for? Well, fortunately, there is somebody out there who isn't too concerned with engine longevity or emissions and has a lot of money. That somebody is the Army of the United States of America. And these engines, the compression ignition versions, are great for them as power generators because, number one, they're very lightweight, so they can be easily carried around. They're very small, so they can pack a lot of them into an airplane. Who cares if they don't last too long, because they last long enough and they can always ship more of them in the airplane. The emissions, really nobody's concerned with that in the Army because the Army is concerned with annihilating enemies, so air quality really isn't on the list of priorities. So, and this probably explains why the Army has given a multi-million-dollar grant to Liquid Piston to further develop these engines. The spark ignition version is probably going to be great for UAVs as well because power dense, lightweight, quiet. What more could you ask for? It's also small. I also think that likely in the future, UAVs are going to be a field where we might see some very interesting internal combustion engine designs that are going to be very small, very lightweight, and UAVs aren't constrained with emissions and stuff like that, nor do the engines need to last very long. So we might see some very interesting stuff there in the future because battery technology simply isn't there yet, and it's too heavy and whatever. So overall, this is Definitely a very interesting engine design. I really like the reverse Wankel idea. It is no doubt creative and it's innovative, and I am sympathetic of the fact that emerging new engine designs, they need to claim very widespread potential application to attract investors, but outside of these few niche specific applications where this engine will likely excel and offer genuine benefits, I don't see a lot of potential for a more widespread application. So there you have it, the non-Wankel reverse Wankel liquid piston X engine, which does not have pistons nor are they liquid. As always, thanks a lot for watching. I'll be seeing you soon with more stuff. Fun and useful stuff on the D4A channel. This is the first time I ever got the outro wrong, and I'm going to keep it in the video. Thanks for watching.